All right, everyone. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Keith Spencer, and I am one of the career experts here at FlexJobs. And FlexJobs, for those of you who don't know, has been the most trusted and leading site for remote job listings since 2007. We are thrilled to have as our guest today Tracie DeFreitas from the Job Accommodation Network to discuss requesting and negotiating workplace accommodations. Before we dive into Tracie's presentation, though, I'm going to cover a few housekeeping items. This will be a 60-minute webinar with a presentation from Tracie, followed by an audience Q&A. Our session today is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed out later this week. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please type that into the Q&A section rather than the chat section. You can also use the thumbs up feature in the Q&A section to vote up any other questions you'd also like to hear the answer to so that we know which questions are most popular. We likely won't be able to get to every question today, but we are confident you'll still learn something helpful. So with all of that out of the way, I will now turn things over to Tracie. Welcome, Tracie, and thank you for joining us.
All right, Keith, thank you so much and welcome everyone. I'm happy to have the opportunity to be here to speak with you today about requesting and negotiating workplace accommodations. I hope this is a topic that is helpful to those of you who may be either in the job seeking process or currently employed and wondering about how to request accommodations. Let's go to the next slide. So our discussion points today are to talk a bit about the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, so that you become familiar with our service. We will then go into an overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I'm just going to hit the surface in terms of just the basic requirements or the foundation of the law, because it is the reason why we're able to request accommodations in the workplace. And then I'll talk a bit about disability disclosure and the importance of this in order to receive accommodations. And then we'll talk a bit about requesting and negotiating workplace accommodations and in the accommodation process. How do we go about doing that? What's to be expected during that process? So we'll start then on the next slide with learning a bit about the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. For those of you who are unaware of the JAN service, we are a national free service, consulting service that was established in 1983, and we're considered the leading source of expert and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations. We do serve customers across the United States and have been doing so for more than 40 years now. JAN helps employers and others recognize the valuable contributions that qualified workers with disabilities add to the workforce. And we do that by providing workplace accommodation solutions, trusted accommodation process strategies, and practical guidance on the employment provisions, Title I, of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And of course, that's a federal law. And it's a federal law that applies to those who are in the United States. Job accommodations, they play a vital role in creating inclusive workplaces and advancing the goals of the ADA, and ultimately increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Now, JAN is a service of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. So they are a federal agency that funds our nonprofit. Our central office is located in Morgantown, West Virginia, though we do have staff working remotely from some other states. JAN is a small federally funded nonprofit service that's operating out of West Virginia University. We employ about 25 people, approximately 14 of which provide the consultation services. On the next slide, this tells you a little bit about the services for employers and professionals assisting employers. Everyone can benefit from JAN services, but our primary customer is employers and professionals assisting employers, like those in human resources, EEO professionals, reasonable accommodation coordinators, legal and rehabilitation professionals as well. These are employers that are of all types, so private employers, also federal, state, and local employers, government agencies, and these are employers of all types and sizes. Jan helps employers and their representatives learn about workplace accommodation options and understand their responsibilities and rights under the ADA, practical ways for engaging in the accommodation process, and also workplace accommodation resources, including referrals to equipment or assistive technology and other services that might be helpful as accommodations. Now, Jan does not provide legal advice or legal advocacy assistance, and we don't have the authority to enforce the law, so we're not a legal service. But for more information, you can go to askjan.org. That's askjan.org. You can see the employers page at our homepage, and it's right there on that homepage navigation bar. But it offers some more information that's useful to employers who might have an interest in learning more about Jan and the information that we have to offer. Now, on the next slide, we also offer information to individuals with disabilities and their family members or advocates. So, to assist these types of Jan users, these might be, again, employees, employee representatives, it could be union representatives or service providers, rehabilitation professionals, and others. It could be advocates, it could be family members. So anyone who's really kind of trying to support someone with a disability in the accommodation process. But what we do for those types of Jan users is provide information on requesting and negotiating accommodations. We offer information on accommodation solutions and basic information about the employment provisions of the ADA. So for more information as an individual, you can go to the askjan.org site page for individuals, which again, you can find right there on the homepage navigation bar at the top. When you go to the individuals page, you will find a whole bunch of resources there, many of which I'm going to cover today. So that's a great place to go if you're wondering about some of the resources that I'm going to mention. You can find them right there very easily. On the next slide. So Jan is a trusted partner in the accommodation process. We help employers and others find effective workplace accommodations for people with all types of health conditions and disabilities. And we're here again to offer practical strategies and information. We're not a legal service, but we can kind of work with you to provide information around the ADA rules, and then really our goal is to work with people in the accommodation process to come up with brainstorm accommodation solutions that enable people with disabilities to perform the essential job duties. And we offer a lot of practical strategies for doing this. But basically, we're here to kind of work as your partner in that process. And our goal is to help offer some optimal approaches for navigating the accommodation process, whether you're an employer or an individual. That guidance is based on our experience working with hundreds of thousands of employers and others across the United States. We do receive more than 40,000 contacts a year, so we do stay pretty busy. Our consultants, they are highly qualified and experienced thought leaders who specialize in various accommodation and ADA matters. And that would be based on different types of health conditions, disabilities, limitations. So we all kind of work in different specialty areas. Those specialty areas fall into some categories. So for example, ADA, cognitive neurological, motor mobility, sensory immunology, and then we also have a small self-employment service that's available to people with disabilities who are exploring entrepreneurship as an option for employment. So that just kind of gives you sort of a quick rundown of some of the services that we provide in terms of information and consultation, and really just kind of being a partner in the accommodation process. On the next slide, you can learn how to contact Jan directly. These services are easily accessed and very convenient. We have various options for contacting the Jan service to receive consultation. So for employers, they can contact us using our toll-free call option. So they can call us directly. Individuals and others can contact us using our live chat feature at askjan.org or by emailing us your questions directly, and you can do that at the home page. Actually, you can use the contact option at askjan.org, or you can email us directly at jan@askjan.org. So lots of options for reaching out. We're here to answer your questions and give you some guidance, but not legal assistance. So kind of keep that in mind. And I think I mentioned this early on, but the service is free, of course, because we are funded by the federal government. So that's just a quick rundown of some of the services we provide. I do want to kind of highlight a couple of other features. So on the next slide, here you can see just sort of a quick screenshot of the askjan.org homepage. Askjan.org offers extensive resources on job accommodation and ADA topics, and it's a great central place to begin your search for this type of information. On the homepage, you will find links to specific information, so resources by audience, like I mentioned, employers and individuals. You can also find our A to Z lists where you can locate information by health condition or disability, limitation, work-related function, topic, and accommodation. So our A to Z list can be very handy. Also, we have a new feature on our site. It's called the Situations and Solutions Finder. This is a feature that offers workplace accommodation examples. And with that, you'll find scenarios and solutions. The results in the Situations and Solutions Finder come from feedback we've received directly from JAN users. Also on the homepage, you'll find other JAN publications, training resources, social media posts. So there's a lot just to be found right there on the homepage. But certainly take some time to explore the site if you're interested in learning more about the JAN service and accessing the resources that we have to offer. So that's just a quick rundown. Hopefully that's helpful, but most of all, if nothing else, at least take away the askjan.org site and you can go there for more information. All right, so with that, on the next slide, let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit and talk some about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So basically, I'm just going to give you a quick overview. We're not going to get into a lot of the details regarding the law, but just a quick overview. On the next slide. So ADA Title I is, so what we're talking about here is a United States federal civil rights law that removes barriers to equal employment for individuals with disabilities who are qualified. This law prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all employment practices, and it also requires that reasonable accommodations be provided to qualified individuals with disabilities unless it creates an undue hardship for the employer. So these are the two statutory requirements: non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation. This law was amended in 2008, and many people know it as the ADA Amendments Act. So with the ADAAA, essentially what happened is the act kind of changed the way we interpret the definition of disability under the ADA. It didn't change the law so much, but it did change the way that we interpret some of the definitions in the law, specifically the definition of disability. The ADA Title I is enforced by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. And so they are the federal agency that must be contacted if you have a complaint to file under the ADA. Next slide. Now here, it's important to understand what a covered entity is under Title I. So job discrimination against individuals with disabilities under Title I of the ADA is unlawful if it's practiced by a covered entity. And that would be any private employer of 15 or more employees. It would be state or local government agencies who employ 15 or more employees. And then also employment agencies, labor organizations, these other types of entities also fall under Title I. Now, there's another law, the Rehab Act, Section 501, which applies to executive agencies of the U.S. federal government. So the ADA does not apply to the federal government employers, but the Rehab Act, Section 501 does. And the ADA and Rehab Act have the same requirements as it relates to non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation. Called the Rehab Act the OG. It was sort of the original law that applied as far as providing accommodations, and then the ADA came after the Rehab Act. But both laws, like I said, have similar requirements. So whether you work for a a private employer, state or local government agency, or a federal employer, there's typically going to be some type of non-discrimination law in place. Now, for more information, there of course are a lot of resources. I've highlighted just a couple on the slides here, and they will be provided to you. Here we have your employment rights as an individual with a disability, and then also a JN resource, the Employee's Practical Guide to Requesting and Negotiating Accommodations under the ADA. So just a couple resources that kind of get more into detail around the foundation of the ADA and covering an individual's rights under the ADA. Now, I mentioned earlier, on the next slide, I mentioned earlier the idea of there being sort of a definition of disability. So it's important to understand that in order for somebody to be covered under the ADA, you must be somebody who's considered a person with a disability under the ADA. So what that means is you would have an actual disability, which is the first prong of the definition of disability. So you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Or the second prong of the definition is that you would have a record of such an impairment. So you may have a past history of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limited a major life activity. Or the third prong, which is the regarded as prong, which comes in where a person's been treated as if they have a disability or perceived to have an impairment that is something that's not what we call transitory and minor. With the first two prongs of that definition, people may be entitled to reasonable accommodation in the workplace. With the regarded as prong, someone is not entitled to accommodation, but they're protected from discrimination. Now, keep in mind the ADA definition of disability is construed broadly. There's no extensive analysis required to determine if someone has an ADA disability. I do tell individuals it's really not up to you to decide that. So if you believe you have a health condition that is affecting your ability to do the job and you need accommodations, go ahead and make the request for accommodation. And then ultimately it is up to the employer to gather the information needed to determine whether you have coverage under the law. So make the request. Don't get too bogged down in worrying about whether you have a disability. On the next slide, something else to keep in mind with looking at the definition of disability is that someone must be qualified and able to perform the essential duties of the job. And that may be with or without an accommodation. But at the end of the day, you must be able to do the work. So what this means is that the person would meet the job-related requirements for the position. So that means, do you have the education, the training, the skills, the licenses, things of that nature? And can you perform the essential job duties with or without an accommodation? So can you get the work done? That's what it boils down to. We do offer a resource, Jan does, on how to determine whether a person has a disability under the ADA, and that resource is linked here. But again, like I said, don't get too bogged down in it as an individual, because it's really not going to be up to you to make that determination. If you think you need something, go ahead and ask for it. Next slide. Now, all of this kind of leads to the idea of requesting an accommodation. So we know the ADA allows for an individual with a disability to make a request for what's called an accommodation. But what does that mean? A reasonable accommodation is a modification or an adjustment to the job or the work environment or the way things are usually done that enable a qualified person with a disability to perform the duties of the job or access benefits and privileges equal to others. Now, the ADA requires reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities during all stages of employment, whether that be the hiring process or once you become employed, and also to gain access to equal benefits and privileges as well. When we look at the term reasonable, that is really a legal term, and it means feasible, plausible. Think of it as something that's possible to provide without it creating that undue hardship that I mentioned, which is something that would cause significant difficulty or expense to provide. And that really is an extremely high threshold. It's kind of rare for employers to claim undue hardship in many accommodation situations, but not all. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, also keep in mind that an accommodation must be effective for the purpose. So ultimately, that means that it enables the individual to perform the job duties or access the benefit or privilege. So it has to be effective. For more information on these sort of terms and understanding this language, there's information that the EEOC provides in their enforcement guidance on reasonable accommodation and undue hardship under the ADA. It's a great go-to guidance on the law. All right, on the next slide. So, when we talk about accommodations, what does that really mean? There's not necessarily a comprehensive list of all types of accommodations. Accommodations can be just about anything that do not create an undue hardship for the employer. Now, when we look at accommodations, there are a lot of common types of accommodations, and those might include making facilities accessible and usable. It could be job restructuring, where we change when or how certain functions are performed, whether they be marginal or essential job duties. It could be flexible or modified work schedules, modifying policies like attendance policies, dress codes, where work is performed, like telework. It can also be providing equipment if equipment is needed in order to perform the job duties, or services like an interpreter or a job coach or a reader if that's needed, and also allowing access for service or emotional support animals when needed due to a disability. We can also see reassignment as a form of accommodation. So when it's not possible to accommodate someone in their original position, they might be considered for a different position that is vacant that they're qualified for. And leave is also a form of accommodation where other types of laws or leave programs don't cover the need for leave. So these are just examples, but these are some of the most common types of accommodations that people do request. Next slide. Now, how do employers know when to provide accommodations? Well, when they're aware that a person with a disability needs one. This means that when an individual indicates that they are having difficulty in the hiring process or performing job duties due to a health condition, the employer should consider whether they are requesting a reasonable accommodation. Now, generally, it's the individual with a disability who must inform the employer that an accommodation is needed, because employers are not expected to guess that an accommodation is needed. And plain language may be used, and the terms ADA or reasonable accommodation are not actually required to be mentioned when requesting an accommodation, although it is recommended that you be as clear as possible. Now, when we think about accommodation, oftentimes this leads to the need to do what we call disability disclosure. So disclosing information, personal health related information, for the purpose of asking for an accommodation under the ADA. Disability disclosure is kind of tricky, and it's something that's very personal in nature, but I do want to talk about it just a little bit and give you some tips to consider. So on slide 18 now. So when we think about disability disclosure, I also want you to think about something called voluntary self-ID. Voluntary self-identification of disability is a little different than disability disclosure, and some of you may be familiar with this, so I do want to kind of point out the differences. Voluntary self-identification of disability is basically the act of checking a box on a voluntary self-identification form. This usually happens during the application process, during onboarding at a new company, or at regular intervals when asked by an employer. And this is for affirmative action purposes. This is entirely voluntary. The point is basically for that employer to collect information about whether they have hired people who have disabilities. It's a very not really very invasive ask, I would say. The form does ask if you have a disability, if you want to declare that, and you don't have to. Again, it's voluntary, but it basically is used in order to meet the requirements of another law, which is called Section 503, and it applies to federal government contractor employers. So those are typically private businesses that receive federal funds. And it's a requirement through Section 503. Again, entirely voluntary. Then we have disability disclosure, which is the act of sharing personal information about a health condition usually in order to receive an accommodation needed to participate at work, whether that be in the hiring process or while you're employed. Disclosure, as I said, is a very personal decision. It is voluntary until you need an accommodation. So when you reach a point where you recognize that an accommodation is needed, you may have to tell your employer information about your disability in order to receive that accommodation. We do offer some good information on disability disclosure topics. One of those resources can be found through our A to Z by topic under disability disclosure. And it hits a lot of information around the disclosure topic. But just briefly on the next slide, I do want to just kind of mention some tips to keep in mind. So with disclosure, it's important not to disclose a disability too soon or too late. So what this means is, yes, you want to disclose a disability when it's known that an accommodation is needed, because again, employers aren't expected to guess. So when it comes time for you to make a request for accommodation, it makes sense to disclose at that point. You don't have to disclose a disability before an accommodation is needed. So it's not necessary to do that too soon. But you do want to disclose a disability before performance suffers or a conduct issue occurs that's related to your disability. So you don't want to wait till it's too late to go ahead and make the disclosure and request accommodation. Of course, you want to share that an adjustment's needed at work for a reason related to a health condition or disability so that you're real clear about why you're making the disclosure. And you want to explain that you're requesting an accommodation. And you also want to make this disclosure with somebody who can act on that. So it's not disclosing to your coworkers, it's talking to a supervisor, a manager, someone in human resources who can act on that disclosure in order to provide accommodation if that's the reason you're disclosing. And then, of course, also don't disclose to everyone. So it's not necessary to disclose to everyone in the workplace that you have a health condition or disability or limitations. That's your personal information, and it doesn't have to be shared with everyone. All right, on the next slide, on slide 20. So after we have disclosed information and we've decided to move forward, that's when we go about requesting a job accommodation. It's, that knowing that the need is there, knowing that you're having some difficulty performing the job duties because of that health condition is what prompts the request for accommodation. And of course, it's important that when we think about making a request for accommodation, there's no fancy way to do it. There's no required way to do it. The EEOC does suggest that individuals with disabilities document their accommodation request in the event that there's any dispute about whether or what was requested. So it's a good idea to make a request in writing, although it's not required. In general, as I mentioned, it is up to the individual to inform the employer if an accommodation is needed. So that responsibility rests with the individual. So if you know you need an accommodation for the hiring process, you'll have to let the employer know. If you need an accommodation once you're employed, you'll let the employer know when you're ready. If maybe it's in several years down the road after you've been in a job, you recognize the need for accommodation. So the timing just kind of depends on what's right for you. And keep in mind, employers aren't required to provide accommodations if they're not aware of the need. So some responsibility falls on the individual to push that forward. On the next slide. So what is an accommodation request? Of course, the interactive process starts with an accommodation request. So anytime an individual indicates that they need a work-related adjustment due to a health condition, a medical reason, then an employer should consider whether the employee is making a request for accommodation. And so essentially there's a connection between a health condition or disability, limitations, restrictions, and a work-related issue. And that's when it's time to engage in that interactive process. So on this slide, we have some examples of what an accommodation request might look like. Of course, Everyone's different in how they go about it, but these are just examples. So if somebody says, for example, I'm neurodiverse, then I need interview questions in advance. That's a request for accommodation. Or maybe somebody mentions they're having difficulty concentrating because of the side effects of medication. That is the request for accommodation. Maybe somebody indicates that they need some time off and they submitted a note from their healthcare provider that asks for leave. Or someone says they need to go to counseling appointments and they want to flex their schedule. It could also be where somebody says that their wheelchair doesn't fit under their desk. And so an adjustment needs to be made for that. So in all of these, you can hopefully see that there's that nexus, that connection between disability and a work-related situation. All right, on the next slide. Now, an ADA accommodation request can be made by either an applicant, an employee. It can also be made by a family member on an individual's behalf if they're unable to make the request. It could come from a healthcare provider or some other representative acting on the individual's behalf as well. And that request can be made verbally or documented, and no specific words must be used or terms, So I mentioned earlier, you don't have to say, I need an accommodation under the ADA. Again, it's a good idea to do that, but the law doesn't require it. Of course, an accommodation need not be made at a certain time, but it is necessary to make the accommodation request when it's known that you're going to need it. It can be made after somebody's hired, even if it wasn't discussed prior to being hired. And it can also be made after performance problems have arisen. But keep in mind that an employer is not required to forgo any discipline or consequences as a result of poor performance that occurred prior to that disclosure or that request for accommodation. So that's why we come back to not waiting too long to make that request. And again, more information can be found in that EEOC guidance on reasonable accommodation. Now, on the next slide, I do want to give you some tips related to requesting an accommodation. These key strategies are for individuals who are considering requesting accommodations. We often get questions at JAN from employees who need an accommodation, but they're not really sure how to approach the employer. So on this slide are some suggestions for requesting accommodations. So first, you do want to decide how you're going to make that request. And again, this can be done in various ways. It doesn't have to be specific, but it could be a face-to-face meeting with the employer. It could be by email. It could be a formal letter to the employer, whatever's most comfortable for you. So there's no official way to do that. And there are also no official ADA forms for doing that, although some employers do have their own forms that they will provide to you so that you document your request if you haven't sent in an email, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, you do want to decide who to ask. I mentioned earlier, you want to ask somebody who can act on the request. So it's not a coworker, but it might be someone in human resources, a supervisor, or a manager. You'll want to explain why you need an accommodation and give your accommodation ideas as well. So let your employer know that you need an accommodation because of a health condition, and then explain any ideas that you might have. That doesn't mean those are the accommodations you're necessarily going to receive, but it's a good place to start. The accommodation process is collaborative, and so both you and the employer can come up with ideas and ultimately settle on something that will be effective. If your response isn't if a response isn't received right away to your request for accommodation, you want to follow up on that. So do find out what the delay is. If it's taking weeks and you haven't heard anything about your request, absolutely you want to follow up on that. You might do it in writing just so you have it documented, so via email, for example, but definitely do a check-in to find out what's going on. And if the employer does request medical information to substantiate your request for accommodation, you do want to respond as quickly as possible because holding that up will delay the accommodation. So you do want to certainly respond as quickly as possible. On this slide, there are some resources related to requesting and negotiating reasonable accommodations, as well as how to request an accommodation form letter. So these are great guides for assisting you in figuring out how to make that accommodation request. And then on the next slide, is an example of a sample accommodation request that is included in one of our resources that offers sample language for requesting accommodations. And this letter that's on this slide is it's brief, but it really makes clear that the employee is requesting accommodations due to medical issues. In this case, the letter mentions mood, sleep schedule issues, concentration, and focus are affected. They go on to mention that the workplace distractions are interfering with concentration and focus. And they would like to try some noise canceling headphones and having a to-do list to keep track of their work. So here we have sort of all those essential elements of a clear request for accommodation. So it's just kind of something to model after, I would say. So, and it's just an example, of course, but that resource, that sample language for accommodation requests, offers some additional information and a couple of other sample letters that might help with requesting accommodations. All right, on the next slide. So that request for accommodation really begins what we call that interactive process, which is simply an ongoing collaborative dialogue between the employer and the employee. It's an informal process. It's intended to clarify what the individual needs and to identify appropriate, reasonable accommodations. Now, when an accommodation is not obvious, an appropriate accommodation really is best determined through a flexible, interactive process. And that there's no standard required process. Employers have their own process, for example, that they can create. So you want to check in with your employer to find out if they have a policy in place. Jan offers a 6-step interactive process that's a sample framework for this accommodation process, and it just kind of lays out some simple steps to follow, which include basically recognizing an accommodation request, so acting on that as the employer, gathering information to better understand the accommodation need, collaboratively exploring accommodations. The employer then chooses and implements accommodations and ultimately monitors accommodations to ensure their effectiveness. That's just sort of the interactive process in a nutshell. But we do have some more specific information on that as a JAN resource on the interactive process through our A to Z by topic. So if you want to learn more about it, certainly check that out. But ultimately, it's just going to depend on sort of what your employer chooses to follow in terms of the process. All right, on the next slide. Let's see here. So here we're talking about engaging in the accommodation process. So you do, again, want to follow any internal accommodation policies and procedures. You do want to engage together in the process. Again, it's collaborative, working together. Individual comes up with ideas, employer comes up with ideas. You may need to talk about the essential job duties to figure out what must be accomplished, what the person's having difficulty doing as a result of the disability or the limitations, the restrictions. So it's really, there's engagement where we work together. When that health condition is not known or the need for accommodation is not apparent, that's where reasonable information or documentation describing the health condition and why the accommodation is needed may be requested by the employer. So you do want to be prepared. If you choose to make an accommodation request, you want to be prepared to provide supporting documentation. Not every employer will ask for it. It's not always necessary, but you just want to be prepared to do that. All right, on the next slide. As an employee, you'll also want to engage with the employer in the process by providing clarity on your accommodation needs. So connect your request to the job performance. Share any experience you have in the past with accommodations that might help to inform the accommodation decision-making process. So if you've had past experience with a particular kind of accommodation, let the employer know, because you already know that that's going to be an effective solution. So help them to understand that it's something that has worked for you in the past. And that should help move the process along pretty quickly. All right, on the next slide. So When we're looking at providing reasonable accommodation, employers may discuss with the employee the nature of their health condition and the limitations. The individual, of course, will likely be the best source regarding their symptoms and any accommodation needs that they have. So we do encourage employers talk to the individual, find out what they need. If it's necessary, the employer can go about getting some medical documentation. For example, they might need to know the type of impairment, what the limitations are, how it limits the person's major life activity, those types of things. They may request information about how an accommodation would enable the employee to perform job tasks as well. So we have to understand that. Excuse me. So we have to understand how those limitations are affecting the person's ability to do the job. But ultimately, when an employer is requesting medical information, they do not need the entire medical record or information that is unrelated to the request for accommodation. So that request should be very specific to the impairment for which accommodations are being requested. So just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes there's a concern that the employer is asking for more than is necessary, and that does happen. No, it's important to go into that knowing what is going to be helpful to the employer. All right, next slide. If there is a situation where you're being asked to provide documentation, we do offer a resource related to medical professionals and information that is useful for them to provide to support a request for accommodation. So I do suggest that as a great resource. Ultimately, you want to provide enough information to show that you have an impairment that substantially limits at least one major life activity. And you do want to provide information that explains why the accommodation is needed and how it can help. So hopefully, if you're doing that, that will suffice and the employer will be happy with that. If you believe that an employer is requesting too much documentation or they're requesting documentation that has nothing to do with your need for accommodation, there is some recourse. We do offer a resource related to dealing with improper requests for medical documentation that kind of walks you through the process of what to do if that does happen. So I do suggest you check that out if you feel like you're in that situation. All right, next slide. Now, of course, JAN offers a lot of resources. EEOC offers a lot of resources related to medical inquiries because it's something that people have a lot of questions about. EEOC guidances are very helpful on these topics. They're set up in sort of a Q&A format that's easy to follow. So here we have a couple of those listed here. So disability-related inquiries and medical exams and the reasonable accommodation guidance are very helpful. JAN, if you go to the askjan.org A to Z by topic page on medical exams and inquiries, you can easily get to those EEOC guidances and other types of resources on medical inquiries. All right, next slide. Now, as we go through the accommodation process, the employer has gathered information, they understand the need for accommodation. Now we need to work together to explore accommodation solutions. Keep in mind, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Impairments and limitations, as well as accommodations, needs are different, and we need to approach each situation case by case. We tell employers, have the full accommodation conversation with the individual. Same thing for the individual. Talk to the employer. Tell them what you need. It's important not to make assumptions about what somebody needs or what they can or cannot do. So if we really have that full conversation and make sure everyone's on the same page, you're going to benefit from that. Excuse me. You want to use resources like JAN to help explore accommodation solutions. We do offer a lot of resources to help with this. So starting on the next slide, I mentioned our A to Z lists earlier. So we have our A to Z of disabilities and accommodations lists. There, again, you can search for information in lots of different ways, but in particular, by disability is a good starting point. We offer a by disability listing. It's not a comprehensive list of health conditions, nor is it a list of ADA disabilities. It's a place to start. We do add to this list periodically based on requests that we receive. But here you'll find some of the more common types of health conditions that we hear about and the limitations that we hear about. So it's a good place to start. With a lot of these, you'll find key accommodation solutions. If you don't find what you need there, though, just contact us directly and we'll be happy to work with you in your unique situation. Next slide. You can also search for information by topic. So if you're not needing to learn more about certain kinds of accommodations like leave or reassignment or light duty, for example, or telework, we have some articles here that can help you learn a bit more about those types of accommodation topics, as well as many others. So check out the A to Z by topic for more information. On the next slide, then, I mentioned earlier this new feature that we have available, the Situations and Solutions Finder at AskJan.org. It really centralizes a lot of accommodation scenarios, and you can filter out the results for the finder by searching on various health conditions and different types of factors. So disabilities, limitations, occupations, there are different drop-down lists that you can use to search for situations and solutions. Again, this is not comprehensive. This is not a list of ADA disabilities or anything like that, but this is feedback that we've received from JAN users that helped us produce these situations and solutions. And it really is just an opportunity to kind of search the range of accommodation options that might be available. So it's a good place to start looking for ideas. But again, if you don't find what you need there, that's when it's a good idea to contact JAN directly. All right, next slide. Now, as you're going through that interactive process and you have explored accommodation solutions together, ultimately it is up to the employer to choose among effective accommodation solutions. So the employer does get to choose and implement the reasonable accommodation. Of course, the preference of the individual with the disability should be given primary consideration when it's reasonable to do so. So, hopefully they will do that. Sometimes they will offer an alternative solution as long as it is effective. That is okay. If we're not sure if an accommodation will be effective, that's a good opportunity to suggest a trial or a temporary accommodation. So basically, it gives us an opportunity to test the accommodation for effectiveness, maybe make some adjustments along the way. So trial and short-term accommodations can be a very effective way to enable someone to stay at work or return to work. So we do suggest that as a great option. And it's a way to negotiate with an employer too. Maybe they're not sure about the accommodation. You can suggest, hey, can we just give it a try for a little while and see how it goes? So we do suggest that. Okay, the next slide. If an employer does offer an alternative accommodation and you believe that it isn't effective, or you've tried it, and I do encourage you to try it first, but you find that it's not effective, then it's useful to inform the employer that it is not effective. And it's a good idea to do that in writing. You do want to explain why the alternative accommodation isn't working. Maybe ask that the original accommodation be reconsidered if it's reasonable. And so, again, you're kind of returning to the accommodation table to go through that process and see if you can get back to the original or some other solution if that's something that's possible. But we do offer a resource related to how to inform an employer that an accommodation is not effective and a sample letter to help you with that too. So you can check that out. Next slide. Now, you may have gone through the accommodation process and you may have found that the accommodation you've requested has been denied. Sometimes that happens. There can be various reasons why an accommodation is denied. It may be that it's not reasonable. It may cause an undue hardship. It may be that the employer isn't well versed in the ADA and doesn't really know what they're doing, but it just kind of depends. There are various factors that can come into play. If that happens, you do want to follow up. You can ask for information about why the accommodation was denied to help you figure out maybe you needed to provide more information and the employer wasn't clear on that. So can you provide more information? Is it that you could offer alternative accommodation solutions if the employer found that the accommodation was not going to be reasonable, would pose an undue hardship? So kind of come back to the table. Look at that as an opportunity to do that. You might be able to appeal the decision. Some employers have an appeal process where you can ask them to reconsider the denial. If ultimately at the end of the day you've done everything you can internally and you're not really getting anywhere with the employer, the recourse would be you can contact your state protection and advocacy organization for help from a sort of a legal advocacy standpoint. They might be able to get involved and get you some support. If ultimately that isn't helpful either, and if you believe as though your rights have been violated or you've been discriminated against, you can file a complaint with the federal EEOC or your state fair employment practices agency. So there is some recourse if you do find that your rights have been violated. We do offer a resource called Your Accommodation Request Was Denied. What now? That goes through all of the steps to consider if your accommodation was denied. So that's a good resource too. All right, next slide. So I, here just kind of want to close out with talking about the importance of communication and that being a key to the accommodation process. So it's really, I think everyone wants to hopefully come to a solution that works for everybody. And we really want to work together and communicate in that process. And that includes collaborating to find solutions that benefit everyone. I think that if we both sides of this accommodation process genuinely want to find a solution and work together, that's going to benefit everyone. It's important to be open and honest about decisions and policies and other information relevant to the accommodation process. That mainly comes sort of from the employer side and making sure that they are being open about the policies and how things work, but also from the individual side in terms of what information you're offering the employer in order to facilitate that accommodation process. It's important to communicate clearly so everyone's on the same page. Communicate as clearly as possible. I know I mentioned the law doesn't require things like a written accommodation request or to be specific, but the more specific you can be, the clearer you can be, the better it really is for everyone. So let's just try to make sure we're doing that. Stay open-minded and adaptable and be creative because, again, accommodations are not one size fits all, right? So we want to be flexible and open-minded and be open to exploring various solutions together. And then again, be open to temporary or trial accommodations as a way to really kind of test things out and see what's going to be effective. So communicating the openness and the willingness to give something a try can go a long way. So I would encourage everyone to definitely do that together. At the end of the day, I think we all hopefully want a workable solution that is going to enable someone to perform their job duties, which benefits both the individual, the employer, and the workforce as a whole. So let's try to collaborate and work together in that interactive process. All right, next slide, and you can just skip to the next slide. On the next few slides, we just have some resources related to ADA rights and responsibilities and disability disclosure and requesting job accommodations. You can go through these on your own. These are both JAN and EEOC resources that you can take advantage of. And so then, and that there's 3 slides there related to different resources that you can access. And then finally on slide 43, we have the JAN contact information. So again, if you are seeking guidance or information about accommodations, you can reach out to JAN. Again, start with the website. It's a great place to find what you need. But if you don't find it there, you can certainly reach out to us as an individual. You can use the email or the live chat feature at askjan.org. And then finally, I will end with just telling you a little bit about social media. If you're not following us on social media, we encourage you to do so. We do post a lot of useful resources and timely information there. You can find us on Facebook, Job Accommodation Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, Jan at Jan on X. And then we also have a robust YouTube channel where we have a lot of different webcasts posted. So check us out, Jan Information on YouTube. With that, Keith, I will kick it back to you and see if we have any questions.
That was wonderful, Tracie. Thank you very much. Comprehensive information, incredibly informative. So thank you. And yes, we do have quite a few questions that have come through. So let's all head to that Q&A tab together, our audience here. And remember to click a thumbs up button if you want to hear the answer to a question someone else has asked. So, Tracie, our first question, this person is asking, I'll sort of paraphrase here, but asking for, recommendations for questions to ask in an interview or green versus red flags to kind of look for to try to determine, a company's actual views on, accommodations, disabilities, et cetera. Do they actually, are they accepting, I guess is the way to put it there.
That's a good question. I'll say, actually, I've been doing this a very long time. I've never been asked that question. So that is a good one. Um, I think there are different ways you can kind of figure that out. So, certainly I tell people check the welcome mat. So what does their website offer you? Is there information easily found regarding how to request accommodations in the workplace? Is there information related to inclusion and flexibility, that kind of thing? So you can start there and kind of do your own research, I would say, a little bit by using the tools that are in front of you. So try the website first. Ultimately, though, yeah, if you are in the hiring process and you're wanting to learn more about the employer and what they do, I'd imagine you might not want to offer too much information at that point. So it really is just about interviewing them. And remember, an interview isn't just about being interviewed. You're also interviewing the employer, right? So I think it's, asking, what sort of workplace flexibilities do you offer? That maybe gives you an idea of, do they offer things like flexible scheduling and telework? Because that kind of, I think that tells you a little something. It's nice that the employer automatically does that, but it might also mean, kind of get a feel for whether they say, well, no, we don't allow that at all. They may not be the most accommodating employer.
Sure.
So, I mean, it doesn't tell you necessarily that they're not ADA compliant or anything like that, but you hope that they would be open to doing those types of things at least. It could even be, what sort of equipment do you provide to your employees in order to do their best work? So just kind of getting a feel for what they're willing to do in a general sense. You could come right at and ask, do you provide accommodations to workers with disabilities if you wanted to? You're not saying that you need an accommodation, but you're just sort of assessing, what their response might be to that. So I think you could go about it various ways.
What about a question, just as sort of a follow-up, a question about, how do you foster an inclusive environment? Would that be a solid one to ask, you think?
Absolutely. Yes, I
Okay.
agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, wonderful. So Tracie, our next question here, it's a little broad. I'm not entirely sure specifically what they're asking. So if you want to skip it, we can.
Okay.
But this person is asking, could you discuss processes with the EEOC? So they didn't specify, sort of what processes. I don't know if you have information you want to share there or not.
I can sort of in brief, but EEOC would be the best to respond to that, of course.
Sure.
So I'm assuming that if someone is asking this, it may be around the complaint process.
Mm,
So typically, if an individual feels they need to file a complaint, they would have to do that first through. So EEOC has a portal on their website where individuals must go to submit information using the portal to file a complaint. And then from there, EEOC will take that information. I believe they schedule an appointment with the individual to gather more information. From there, they will assess whether it is something that requires further investigation.
mm,
So they might investigate the employer to find out more information. Or if the EEOC feels as though it's not a complaint they're going to move forward, they would give an individual a right to sue letter, in which case
mm,
they would contact their own personal attorney and sue the employer on their own. So there are several steps to go through to get to that point. EEOC actually has some very good resources on their site. If you go to the employees, or I think it's employees tab at eeoc.gov,
mm.
they have some information about how to file a complaint, what to expect once you do that. So they do break it down.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Let's try to squeeze in maybe two more questions here. So this next person is asking, are you allowed to request that meetings be recorded or transcripts provided? I don't know if that falls in the legal realm or not, but what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. And that's not an uncommon request for accommodation if
Mm,
someone needs that for a disability related reason. I will tell you, it's probably one of the more challenging ones in terms of accommodations for employers to provide, because depending on the circumstances, there could be reasons why they would not be allowed to record meetings.
mm,
So, for example, if there's confidential information or there are any rules related to that information being recorded, that could be problematic.
mm,
So, make the request. Ultimately, it's up to the employer to figure out whether it's something that's feasible. Can they do it? And if they can't, there may be some other ways to ensure the person gets the information they need.
Very good. Thank you. And then let's see. I think we'll make this our last question because we're getting close to our end time here. But this person is sharing, they said, I know it's not the employer's job to know about my disability, but the ADA talks about engaging dialogue. How can I get them to offer specific ideas since they know the job better than I do? I have a very hard time advocating for myself and my disability. And then they also thanked you for doing this.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's important to try to do the best you can to advocate for yourself, or if there are others who can support you in that. That could be friends, family members. It can be an advocacy organization as well. So do consider that support if you feel like you're not comfortable or able to do it yourself. I think it's important to, an employer often needs to really have an understanding of what are you having difficulty doing, and we do need to connect that to the job tasks. So you need to be able to share as much as you can about what you're having difficulty doing. That doesn't mean you have to come up with the solutions, but it does mean you have to explain the why. Why are we having difficulty? How are we having difficulty? How does this affect my ability to do the job? So though the employer might know the job task, they don't know how you perform the job task or how you have difficulty with it. So I think it has to be very personalized. So providing what you can be very helpful. And again, I think it might help to have somebody else who can advocate or support you in that process. That might include bringing somebody else into an accommodation meeting with you who can help, whether it's helping with expressing what your needs are or supporting what your needs are.
But I think it also reemphasizes your point about it needing to be, a collaboration, communication being extremely important. It can be kind of a back and forth sort of brainstorming in that situation.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, we are a minute over time, so we'll go ahead and close up here. But thank you, Tracie, so much for being here. I know that was incredibly valuable information to share with our attendees today. Thank you to our attendees as well for participating and asking your insightful questions. But thank you again, and I hope that this was helpful for everyone.
Thank you, Keith.
All right. Take care.